substance equals spin. The propaganda's a win, stress feeding on my tension. My countrymen, they love their fiction. Words are now, it's made with good intentions.
Welcome to 1 or 200. We're back for another episode of Current Events. I'm joined by do we say a bevy of co-hosts? I don't like the word. A range of co-hosts, multiple co-hosts, some co-hosts.
A smorgasbord.
An amount of co-hosts.
An amount, yeah.
A bevy.
I was going to say an indefinable amount, but I know exactly how many co-hosts are here. How you doing, Oliver?
Yeah, good. How you doing?
Ginny, how are you?
Yeah, that sound that you just made, bottle that and repeat that, and that's how I'm feeling.
Fantastic. And we've got Simone as well. How are you, Simone?
I'm not in Hamilton, actually.
Hey, look, things are looking up. No, we love Hamilton.
Curiously.
We love Hamilton.
Interesting. I left my duly elected representative PMax there behind to make sure that it was still just the good old Tron that you thought it was in 50 years' time, where slowly farmland turns into American suburbs.
Wow. Much like a lot of New Zealand, frankly. Let's kick it off with some discussion about Gaza and the continuing genocide in Palestine. Things are bad. It is fucking horrific. Every day I want New Zealand media outlets to just all fold. I don't care what happens to them. They all lose their jobs. Okay, I'm sorry. Like, you know, there's some good journalists, blah, 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 blah. We've done it all before. You know, I accept, hey, some of you aren't doing international news reporting. That's fine. But Jesus fucking Christ. Yeah.
It seems like that might be part of it. We talked a little bit, I think, a few podcasts back. It was right after the ceasefire. And we sort of talked about that fear that the ceasefire, while objectively great, while the exchange of Palestinian hostages and the freeing of Palestinian hostages was a marvelous outcome of that whole process, that there is a risk that it would sort of dampen the momentum of the discussion, because knowing full well that Israel wasn't going to honor the ceasefire, and lo and behold, they broke it within 20 minutes and have broken it every day since, and now they've officially broken it. Like, I don't know, they crossed the new threshold where they're now killing hundreds of people in short spans of time. And so now it's, I don't know, it's more officially broken. And now they're talking about how they've broken it. And it's not getting the same amount of widespread, maybe that's just my perception, but it's not getting the same amount of widespread hate that it was before, which is worrying because it's ongoing.
This has been the ratchet effect that Israel has used for decades, right? Do an atrocity, cool it off a bit, you know, people talking about hospital bombings, for example. Release a whole bunch of Hasbara propaganda about how actually it was Hamas bombing the hospital. And then a little bit later, just bomb all the hospitals all the time, and then start announcing that you're bombing the hospitals and breaking international law. But because of the way that the narrative has developed under the watchful eye of Western media bosses and their dutiful reporters, it's seen as normal now for Israel to flagrantly break international law and murder hundreds of people.
And not just Israel either, because now we're seeing sort of America testing the waters with that, where this whole signal leak thing, where they announce in the chat that they've blown up an apartment building, and the only thing anyone in any sort of major media outlet is talking about is the OPSEC issue, the fact that they accidentally added a journalist to this chat.
Accidentally.
But nobody is looking at it and going, okay, but hang on, in the chat logs, can we talk about the fact that they blew up an entire apartment building, killing hundreds of civilians to get one guy, and they're bragging about it, and they're joking about it, and it's a very serious war crime that would have ended the career of a politician 10 years ago.
I think what New Zealand should do is make sure we've still got military assets out there helping to aim those bombs.
I think it would have ended it because it was gauche, not because it was wrong. I mean, people remember that the person who really ramped up the predator drone program initially was Obama, and he personally oversaw killing American citizens like Anwar al-Awlaki, right?
But that was, I think what I mean is not so much that, of course, they were unapologetic in doing it, but at least there was consequences. At least they tried to hide it because there was political downsides to being that bloodthirsty, and now there's not. So there is
I
a
think
ratchet of that degree that Israel has shown you can do whatever you want, and you won't even get criticized for it anymore.
the tone has changed. Like H.W. Bush said after they shot down an airline, America never apologized, or I will never apologize for America, right? So the distinction really is that you can be genteel, but now they can be vulgar about it. And that was something that the New York Times, I think you're quite right, was pearl clutching about in 2016 during Trump's first term, was look how uncouth he is. And now that everybody's got used to the uncouthness, it turns out that the underlying policy doesn't matter. So to draw it back to something that Kyle's just saying before, I think the ratchet effects, it long predates Hamas, right? Like this has been the case so long as Israel has existed, but it hasn't been an American ally except since, what was it, the 70s, somewhere around there. So previously they would say, rather than Hamas, these Arab countries are out to get us. They're preternaturally disposed. They hate us for our freedom, to quote the great poet George W. Bush. And once they had that pretext, they would seize land. Seize the Golan Heights, get the post 1967 borders, to infiltrate, through the settler program, the West Bank, and always they would encroach or annex something, or in some way violate the non-aggression principle of the UN Charter. And then widely this would be condemned by countries at the United Nations, but there were no enforcement mechanisms because the United States would veto anything from being able to come through the Security Council. And therefore, it then becomes precedent. So on the one hand, you have the General Assembly for decades saying that this is an intolerable situation, that Israel does not have a right to do anything that it has been doing since its founding, since the Nakba, that Palestine has a right to violent resistance against violent occupation at international law. That is the legal position. That is the position of the countries of the world. But nevertheless, there is this disjunct between what is said through resolutions at the General Assembly and through non-enforcement at the Security Council. And therefore, in reality, once the ratchet moves, it never goes back. No. And that has accelerated, I think, as everybody's recognized throughout this acute portion of the genocide in Gaza, i.e. beginning from October the 8th.
To the point even where sometimes the UN's not even condemning it anymore. There's not even that fig leaf of condemnation, because there was that recent announcement by Israel that they're going to be setting up permanent occupation colonies in Lebanon and Syria, in both territories beyond the Golan Heights. And they just casually said that. They said, we're just going to need to do that. It's just a forward position thing, which is what they said about Golan Heights. They said it's just a defensive thing. We need to hold onto this territory as a buffer zone, was what they used to describe it as. And now they've done the exact same thing. And when Golan Heights was seized, there was condemnations. There was a round of nations calling out saying, this is unacceptable. We're not going to do anything about it. It's intolerable, but we will tolerate it. This time, there hasn't even been an outcry over it. So there's that development as well. There's no sense of like, someone needs to be applying the law. There's not even that sort of hand-raising, sort of pearl clutching anymore. We've just begun tolerating infinite imperialism from Israel in the United States.
And if you're a regular news reader in New Zealand, as opposed to a freak like the rest of us, or I guess a lot of people listening to this podcast, sorry to our audience, you wouldn't.
Sorry, liberals.
You wouldn't have heard most of this, right? You wouldn't have heard most of this stuff. And we just had a report come back in the last week and a half or so where Radio New Zealand was investigating its coverage of Gaza and gave itself a clean bill of health. Said
CIA finds no link between itself and the crack trade, I think is the classic pull.
Incredible. And essentially said, it's because we get complaints from both sides, and I think it's mostly people are complaining to us because they're emotional about what's happening there, not with any real basis. And what's the other really egregious piece of reasoning? Israel is closer to us culturally, so we tend to cover more Israeli spokespeople. Not even Israeli news. I want to be really clear about that because if we had purely Israeli news coverage here, we'd have a much better idea about what was happening. It's really bizarre. We don't have the perspectives of Palestinians frequently at RNZ because Palestinians are culturally distinct from New Zealanders, is essentially the argument they were making, and that's fucking foul.
Unvarnished racism. And
Just incredible.
I like how in their own self-report, when they reported on the outcome of their review, they used the phrase, since Palestinian armed groups attacked Israel and the subsequent Israeli response.
That
And I was
that was
like,
from Colin Peacock at Media Watch. That's not even in the review. That's
like this is you talking about whether or not you have a like pro-Israel bias, and you refer to October 7th as an attack. What the Palestinians do is attacking, but what Israel did is not attacking. It's merely responding. And what does that response entail? Well, we're not going to go into it. We can't go
sorry,
into what that response means.
friend of the podcast, Hayden Donnell. Your compatriot Colin Peacock has made Media Watch almost dead to me. By doing that kind of egregious, like it's actually
It's
absurdly
disturbing.
Kyle, why do you deny that history started
facetious.
on October the 7th?
It's so like there's no way that Colin Peacock doesn't know exactly what he did there. Like he's a smart enough guy. Like, he's done some good reporting before. He knows what framing is. It's fucking Media Watch to fucking pitch the conflict in that way is intentional and it's fucked.
I think it's probably also important to mention that in this review, what stood out to me anyway, as like as a consultant who sometimes has to work at a place that gets asked to do like lit reviews or press reviews for publications, one thing that most consultants will do is have a slide in their 60-slide deck, right? Which is like, here are the things that we think you just shouldn't change. Here's what we think you should rightfully ignore. And Colin Peacock, I think, covered this in his review of the review. One of the critiques that was suggested by this external, non-external consultant that they should reject completely was basically that some complaints appear to be motivated by what they considered to be undisguised Semitism, undisguised anti-Semitism. Like and also just to put those, I think, and he said this, I think, in a paragraph shortly after he talked about basically people having issues around the use of the word Palestine, use of the word illegal, terrorist, and genocide. So basically saying that people who are complaining about the use of these terms being applied only to Palestinian people, like Palestinian terrorists, Israelis are rightfully there, that sort of thing. That critique of that overly was anti-Semitic, which I thought was an insane thing to read from a journalist. So they were like, everything about this, sure, put like a 14-step program together about changing your language slightly and don't use pull quotes or like quotation marks around Israeli people being not guilty of genocide or something. But you should actually just ignore people's critiques based on anti-Semitism. Like, why? Like, why did you even bother doing this review?
Well, you see, it's a legitimate report if there's a slide deck, and it should be listened to.
I think, yeah, it really just underlined for me everything we kind of already knew, right? Like over the course of doing a few IAs, and seeing just how unwilling RNZ was to even interrogate the possibility that they were being biased about this. It's absolutely bizarre. There've been like a couple of good write-ups. One by Mick Hall on his Substack in Context, and another one by a friend of the cast, Johnny Filmo, over on his Substack, just going through the review and picking it apart. But it's just incredible how blatant it is, how obviously they're whitewashing, and they know they're whitewashing. And at some point, there's going to be consequences of this shit, but it's not today.
There is one consequence of this shit, which was that recent media trust poll that came out that showed that it is literally the worst it has ever been in the history of the country. So I think the low point was 27% of people polled said that they trust major New Zealand media outlets to be honest brokers of information.
That's worse than the US, right?
Worse than America. Yeah. Yep.
Well done, cunts.
America was sitting around like 36 or something percent, but in New Zealand, it's just basically no one believes the newspaper anymore, which is pretty bad, but also not undeserved, because the newspaper has been peddling in deliberate disinformation for reasons beyond our comprehension. Well, we kind of comprehend it, but no one will admit it.
Yeah, and that's been accelerating as well. And especially like I felt as someone who like is reading too much news, I want to be really clear about this. I was continuously plugged into like news analysis and media analysis since the 2023 election campaign, right? Where there are a range of really clearly evidentially provable falsehoods peddled by the mainstream outlets en masse, some of which got called out within weeks with like substantial reasoning for why the media was wrong on this. I'm thinking in particular National Party's tax break promises. Craig Rennie completely took it apart. It came 2 weeks before the election. And in the month or so prior to that, you had basically every outlet saying, "Whoa, National eating Labour's lunch. They're doing it for working people." And when it was revealed that they were all wrong, every political reporter basically had been running this line. They were all wrong. We saw a number of them openly. Multiple on Twitter in their personal capacity, I guess. I don't know. Apparently, they're not journalists while they're on there, blaming the audience for not doing their own research. It wasn't their fault that they had parroted, amplified, and presupposed the outcomes of National's campaign announcement. It was the fault of the audience for not crunching the numbers, which it took the CTU economist a couple of weeks to do. It was the audience's fault for not all doing that themselves individually in the face of a full press media pack.
Also, it was really unfair because it was a big beat up, and it was, why are you bullying journalists who are just small beans trying to live their life and report on the things that they're being told without investigating it?
But it's got worse and worse. And I guess if we're staying on this, because we are staying on this topic.
Carl's
This
like,
week,
podcast.
we'll keep going.
this is what we're talking about. This is all we're talking about now. One of the big media stories this week, at risk of just giving it more airtime, I guess, but it's worth doing our own little media watch about, was the reporting on Tamatha Paul's comments. Green Party MP Tamatha Paul made some comments at a university panel about alternatives to policing, saying that some of her constituents didn't feel safe around police, and maybe we should give resources to other organizations better suited to deal with situations like mental health crises.
She made the ridiculous comment that electrocuting a mentally ill person to death is bad, which is obviously silly. That's what you're supposed to do. That's what we want our police to be doing.
And it's just been absolutely absurd to see the way the media, and we've seen this so many times, and it's always Wahine Māori, right? Like, who are targeted like this. Suddenly, every single outlet is running it front page with multiple stories and just lying, just outright lying about what was being said.
Well, that was the thing that sort of stuck out to me, is what Tamatha Paul said. Tamatha Paul is correct, objectively correct, measurably correct. We know it to be true, but it's being presented as something ridiculous. And one of the things she said was the majority of people in prison are in prison for non-violent crimes.
Well, and this predated even the story, right? This was like a little while back, and now they're trying to claim like she's been under fire for a month. Like,
and so one of the people who reported on it said, well, 36% of people in prison are in there for violent crimes, and 21% are in there for sex crimes. And if you add those numbers together, it's 57%. But you're not supposed to add those numbers together because sex crimes fall under violent crimes. And so what they've done is they've deliberately split off these numbers to create literally just a completely false impression of reality, and give the sense that what she'd said, the majority of people in prison in there for non-violent crimes, make it seem like it was a silly thing to say, when in fact it's just the truth. It's just a fact.
Majority of people in prison haven't been convicted and sentenced.
But like, this is
they have
thing,
the fucking presumption of innocence. Jesus.
Yeah. Like, they're on remand. Because the system's
there is actually I should say there is actually a split between those who are on remand awaiting sentencing and have had a conviction entered, and those who have not, right, and are awaiting some kind of trial or other part of the criminal process, yeah, and those have the presumption of innocence. But still, nevertheless, like the fact that this has steadily gone up over decades, I don't know. I was listening to a talk from a judge who's now moved to Wellington, and what his honor was saying was there is a real concern, and not every judge, especially the district court, has this concern. So, in fact, many of them, I'm sure, really love it. But steadily, the population of our prison, the percentage of it, being people who have not been sentenced and are actually serving out their time, has increased. And this is because of changes to bail. And you can look at it every time the law is changed to restrict the ability for people to get bailed, it goes up. But this is not only just because of legal changes, there are also practical changes. Now, there's been the case of, his name is escaping me, the homeless man who was on hunger strike. I don't know if somebody can help me out. The thing that I'm surprised about in this case, in any case, is that this has gained any sort of national attention, not because it's undeserving, but because he is one of many people. The number one determinant when I am making a bail application for somebody is, do they have a home? Now, the need for an address is not in the Bail Act, but it does not matter. A judge will require somebody to not be homeless effectively, or otherwise there has to be some other form of support. There has to be some charity filling the gap. There has to be some form of social service doing it, right? And this is not universally true. There are other things that can be done, like a reporting condition, etc. But there are so many factors against somebody who doesn't have shelter, who doesn't have a job, who doesn't have the white picket fence life from being able to get bail, that as we've seen inequality worsen, it hasn't been needed necessarily to make these legal changes to these amendments to the legislation to restrict bail in order to make sure that more of our population are doing free work in prisons and or enriching these security companies like Serco, right? They can't just lock more people up. Not for crimes, but for being poor.
And it seems like that is part of that deliberate strategy. I mean, the new sentencing laws that you sort of shared in the chat the other day that is predicted to increase a 40% rise in prisoner population over the next decade, which is a staggering number of people. But the thing is, none of this is mysterious. None of this is coming out of the blue. We already know what National and ACT have been sort of pushing for, which is privatization of New Zealand prisons. And this is part of that program. They're kind of just running the same playbook they have on our health system, which is strip out resources, increase intake, put the system under pressure, wait for the system to start falling to pieces, and then once it's falling to pieces, start then pitching to people the idea of privatization. So they're doing it with health. They're trying to put this pressure on the system. They're getting all these people on waiting lists, getting everyone panicking, going, why am I in this situation? They'll do the same with the prisons. They're going to just get these prison populations up and start showing all these sort of terrible conditions and going, look at this mismanagement of the system. You know who's going to do it better. We need to expand the access of Serco into our system. We need to let more international companies come in here. We need to expand our laws. And then we go, well, now we've got all these guys in prison. We also need to, make use of their time in there. So they'll reinvent this American system of chattel slavery within their prison system, because that's always been the goal. That's always been the aim of this entire project, is privatization.
Yeah, firstly, people associate that with the restrictive securitization of it and of, like you're noting, the privatization of prisons itself. But the privatization, as it already exists, is not only within the punitive component. It also exists within what I would call the NGO industrial carceral complex, and the parasitic octopus of different charities which suck up MOJ contracts in order to fulfill essential social services for people who are going through the criminal system and need some sort of support. Otherwise, they will be set up to fail. And many of them are indeed set up to fail. For example, if you don't have a home, needing to be bailed to a night shelter or a shelter which continues to, give somebody shelter night after night, they oftentimes have rules which are quite specific to them. So, for example, they might be a religious one, and therefore you have to attend their chapel, or you have to in some way not use the drugs that you are addicted to. You have to somehow yourself just magically get clean of methamphetamine in order to have the right to not be in there, right? Or not to drink alcohol is a good example of that, right? Something which is legal, but we must control these people's behavior. So there's so many millions of dollars being poured into these non-governmental organizations, which are charities. And there is already this privatization, not only through what we would see the punitive component, but also the supposedly helping and ameliorating component, which in fact is really just a kind of both control and money-making exercise. Now, they're not making huge profit from this. I don't want to suggest that, but the stripping away of state support, for example, the idea that somebody could have a place to live because we actually provide housing for people, is something which is a part of that entire matrix. They are two sides of the same coin. This is a single monster. And the second thing is, and I think you've touched on this very briefly, is that the intention with this, with creating this kind of class of enslaved persons or and otherwise incarcerated persons, is the disciplining of the labor class. It is not a coincidence that this is happening at the same time that National has manufactured a recession and is causing unemployment to go up while upping benefit sanctions, because when people don't have money, they will commit crimes, they will shoplift, they will get nappies for their kids, then they are incarcerated, and this is held up as a threat, a big stick in front of the remaining labor class that says, you better not ask for wages too high. You better not leave your job where you're being sexually harassed. You better not step out of line. Remember your place in the working class. That is the purpose of it.
Yeah. And it's all part of the same discourse machine. When media pick up this kind of stuff, it's no coincidence that these sentencing laws are going through, and suddenly we have this outrage by a left-wing MP, right? And the media runs around to every other party leader except for Te Pāti Māori for some reason and asks them to openly abuse a young Māori woman MP, reporting on her constituents live on camera.
And taking a facts-based, like an evidence-based approach to criminal justice reform. Because that's the thing that I just keep hammering on, is like, she's just correct. And so, like, when you see these sound bites of Luxon and David Seymour and Winston Peters and, for fuck's sake, fucking Chris Hipkins,
that was embarrassing.
The quote-unquote Labour Party joining in this beat-up, the thing you have to keep in mind is all of those men are completely delusional. They're not engaged in reality. They either don't know or they're deliberately lying, but they simply don't understand the facts of the situation, and they're talking out of their ass. And yet that's what's being reported on. It's being talked about as though they have some kind of authority, but they're just objectively, factually wrong about the reality of policing and the prison system in New Zealand.
And just using language which would probably get them censured if it was aimed at anybody else.
It's
which is
actually
absurd.
ridiculous. Like, if you look at the search, sorry to interrupt you. I hope that we have someone, I'm speaking now to someone, in my mind, there is someone listening to this podcast right now who is like a junior level person at the Herald or staff or RNZ or something. And you do know, right, that once you publish the news with whatever SEO shit tagline your boss asks you to use, aka Tamatha Paul in La La Land, what planet are the Greens on?
It's not called reality.
What? Tamatha Paul, ill-informed, stupid, and totally out of touch. Once you publish these headlines and your boss has gotten like a really great engagement boost from the first day, you can go back into the CMS and just change them. Just change them so that when Google re-indexes your site 5 days from now, it just magically won't be there anymore. But your boss won't fire you because you've already got the engagement on the day. You can just do this. I believe in you. If you're listening to this podcast, you're ready to radicalize. You can just do this. Okay? There is no need to run that line for the coalition, especially if you're the spinoff. Why would you put in your headline, is Tamatha Paul in La La Land? Why the fuck would you do that?
That was the one thing about the People Against Prisons Aotearoa piece, right? Which was a fantastic piece. And was doing everything that you were talking about, Oliver, in terms of providing all the evidence that Tamatha Paul was just correct. Oh, we got to get the SEO. We got to do this fucking headline. Just like get fucked. And like, I don't care. Like, come on. You're also buying into the fucking framing. Like,
Yeah.
it's really frustrating to see the way like discourse management happens in that way. Like, oh, but that's just what everyone's seeing, and that's what people are clicking on. No, it's because
You're making them see it.
yeah, there's
Yeah.
no counterexample. Like, how about you try writing? Oh no, I'm gonna get myself arrested. Don't worry. Um,
And like,
but
okay, or from like a practical perspective, like as well, like I know that, and this is as someone who works in media publishing, it's like I know that everyone's like, oh, like SEO is like really important, like it's what gets clicks. But like the trust survey that was done recently, or at least for the year of 2024, I think in New Zealand actually the figures were something crazy. It was like something like more than 75% of people in New Zealand actively avoid the news, which is actually 30% higher than America. And if we rag on America for getting their news headlines about like, I don't know, like ketamine and horse drugs and stuff from conspiracy theory Facebook groups, that same thing is happening twice as frequently in New Zealand. People are actively avoiding news outlets. So if you think about it, your clickbait SEO headline doesn't matter at all. Like most of the country is actually actively avoiding it. All they're going to see if they Google something, they're just going to read the headline, see that you've called Tamatha Paul crazy, and then be like, oh, vindicated, and move on. Because they're not going to actually read your entire article where you explain that she's not actually in La La Land, that you actually support her policies.
yeah,
You know,
it's
also,
pretty
if it
observed.
were about clickbait, you can say David Seymour is in La La Land, which is factually correct, and that would also get people to click
Yeah.
because most of
People
the
would love that.
country hates
You,
his guts.
you could say
Or
David
you know what you
Seymour
could
covered up for
say?
Tim Jago, right? Like,
Yeah, David Seymour aided and abetted a child rapist. Boy, that'd
Yeah,
get you some clicks.
Yeah,
exactly.
damn.
apparently it's not really about the clicks, and we know that
A
now.
salacious
Da-
TVNZ documentary, like, you know.
David Seymour harassed and bullied rape victims. A
Mm.
factual thing that you could put in a headline that would get you a lot of
I
clicks.
think
How come?
If
How
you can
come we're
use
not?
Betteridge's law of headlines, it's like, is David Seymour a pedophile question mark? And then it's like, well, we're not saying he is, you know.
yeah, it's
And the
the thing
answer is
is
always no when you pose a question. So it's okay actually to say that.
what I hear
Well, you
from
can't say no either, though.
media insiders is that they just don't have the resources to type things into keyboards like this.
See, when
I
you
mean, the
Unfortunately.
truth is that
when you get into a news organization, they implant the severance chip in your brain, and if you try to write about Tim Jago, your hands go to the keyboard, and your brain just kind of gets fuzzy and all sort of white, and you can't type it. That's the thing.
Whoops.
They don't tell you. Sorry,
Well,
Ollie.
I mean, we know what the answer is because we can sort of beat around the bush. But the truth is, it's because our media organizations are being run by ideologues,
Well,
and
yeah,
that's
this is
kind of, I mean, that's where that editorial line comes from. Because we have people like Sinead Boucher, who is part of a right wing lobbying group, who is also now the CEO
I
of
think you'll find
Stuff.
it non-political.
No,
Yeah.
well, yeah, I mean, yeah,
Impartial and non-political,
awesome.
she'll have you know.
Yeah, well, that's certainly the way that they like to frame it, which is weird because every time anyone ever says they're impartial and apolitical, they have the politics of fucking Adolf Hitler. This is the thing. They're pushing constant right wing stuff, and then suddenly the editorial line of Stuff, we shouldn't be surprised that they're not willing to engage with any sort of left wing ideas in good faith. We shouldn't be surprised that their coverage of Gaza is
That's
explicitly
just
and
how it
deliberately
is. So why are you even
pro-Israel.
complaining about it?
And it's so funny because it doesn't make sense from a financial standpoint. They have this massive erosion of trust. They have this kind of loss of subscribers. They're sort of falling apart. Uh, they're fighting. I mean, you look at Israel and you look at the way that the vast majority of the world sees it, which is they recognize the atrocities, they recognize the genocide, but the newspapers are sort of constantly trying to push back on that narrative because they think that they can fight the tide, and all they're doing is just cutting off their own noses to spite their face. They're pushing this stuff, and all it does is further erode that trust because everyone goes, why are you trying to lie to me? Why are you saying, stop believing your eyes and start believing our words? It's weird, and it's going to lose. It has to lose the money in the
Well,
long run, unless they're receiving some kind of like dirty money in the back that's better than the money that they get from
I
subscription.
mean,
Actually, hashtag believe women, believe Sinead Boucher when she says bullshit.
well, the thing is as well, it's like it's cultural capital, right? Like most of the people working in media don't get this shit, right? They're not getting any kickbacks. They're not getting networking opportunities. It's people at the top of the chain, and you go all the way back to that fucking BBC Chomsky episode where he's like, yeah, you just wouldn't be in this role unless you already met those the
Criteria.
the necessary characteristics for someone working in the media. And that was what, 40 years ago, 30 years ago.
The interview
And
was with Andrew Marr.
that's
Yeah.
the one. And it's just got worse. Like, yes, neoliberalism and the corporatization of media has made it a worse situation for journalists. They have less resource. They're under all these pressures. Yeah, that's really sad. I fucking hate that. Like, I also want like people who work in media to have good, stable jobs where they're not forced to be cunts. Unfortunately, that's where we are, and you can make a decision about like what you do with that. There's a really interesting. This is one of those really interesting things about New Zealand media sometimes is that because stuff is just being reported, and there's not a level of analysis all the time. Like a lot of the stuff isn't crafted, right? It's not like, oh, we're gonna really fucking push the discourse in this direction. It's hijacked, and then just everyone does the same fucking thing. You don't have independent reporters independently like going through and typing up a fucking missive like this is how we're gonna make sure we fucking nail Tamatha Paul. They're just jumping on this fucking carousel. But you've had a couple of really interesting pieces of information that just almost accidentally dropped into the discourse. The first one is on the Tamatha Paul situation, where I think it was a Stuff journalist when they're trying to pitch this idea that Paul had been under fire for comments for months, right, or for a month, as opposed to it being confected within like 2 days over the weekend. And as part of that, they quoted an ACT Party newsletter or PR release from last week, where they mentioned she had been at this panel and asked, should the Greens have to answer whether they want to abolish prisons or something similar? And you're like, wait a second, that was at the beginning of last week. And now suddenly, every news organization and every other media, like every government, political party, and Labour reporting this in concert. Like, where did it come from exactly? Like, there's a real clear pipeline here, which basically no one else has reported on, or even considered as potentially meaning that this is purely political. But from my point of view, if a political party, if a far-right political party has put out a press release claiming something, or no, they didn't even claim it. They did the asking the question thing. And then we end up with like what, 2 days straight of multiple stories on every major New Zealand outlet. You should be asking questions about how news is being created. The second thing is this recent Andrea Vance piece about
Oh, come on.
the Free Speech Union working with James Grennan to take over NZME. And that's like frightful, and it's in the first place. Like that's crazy. Like everyone knows now, or should know, that the Free Speech Union is a far-right astro-turf organization that openly supports white supremacists under the guise of free speech. And yet they're still treated as if they're just like a little fucking startup pro-free speech lobby group, right? There was 2 sentences in there about the way that the Free Speech Union operates. And they claimed, and there's no reason to think this is not the case, that for the last couple of years, they had had direct engagements with Michael Boggs, the CEO of NZME,
Yeah.
to push him on editorial direction and the way that NZME was run as a media org.
Yeah.
Alongside that, they had also been working over the last couple of years with major shareholders in NZME to push their specific line about freedom of speech and editorial decision making. And that has culminated in the attempted editorial takeover by James Grennan on the back of this 10% buy-up of NZME shares.
Now, for listeners at home, you might hear the name Michael Boggs and think, man, I don't ever hear about any of these people. Just hop on the internet and do a quick search for Michael Boggs, and then pop onto the image tab and check out the first thing that comes up. Well, it might not be the first thing. It'll be pretty high up. One of the
I
top
know what you're
stories
talking about, actually.
will be Michael Boggs in blackface. Yeah, he went to some dress up party and was trying to. I think he was trying to be a rapper or something. I don't know. Part of it, but he wore blackface, and there was a whole scandal about it. And then just kind of have a look down at sort of this guy, and just try to get a sense, at least from just googling this man, what he might believe about the world or what his worldview might be. This man who was in charge of NZME.
Even before he has been deliberately and specifically tapped up by a far-right astro-turf group that regularly defends white supremacists, right? Like this is happening at the top of the news hierarchy. And there's no reason to believe that this isn't happening across other outlets as well. And when you have that level of penetration of media leadership, there's no reason why the CEO of fucking NZME should be meeting these cunts. Like, except that they have a shared interest in like going in a specific direction. And we've seen that happening in real time. And it makes, this is something that we've posited previously, like these fuckers are everywhere doing this shit. Now there's actually evidence of it. Yeah, I guess that's my piece on how fucking destitute the New Zealand media environment is. But yeah, it's designed, it's coordinated, it's with intent. Doesn't matter whether or not like a whole bunch of reporters are liberal or not. The people who are in charge of this shit, who are deciding like who they advertise with, what the pressures on the media workforce are Nazi adjacent.
Also, Carolyn Louis is leaving NZME, which is an interesting and sudden shift. Even the news reporting on it have said, well, this is kind of an interesting development immediately after Grennan made his investment. But yeah, one of his sort of things I think he said on his way in was that he wanted to downsize the board, and it'll be interesting to see who gets downsized out of that. But the first one to go is a non-white woman.
Who could have guessed?
Interesting to me, thinking generally about the attacks on people like Tamatha Paul. That I mean, a little while ago, right? We were saying, where is Chris Hipkins? He's just collecting his salary and not saying anything, leave the position. And where's he going? Why is he not talking? And then he started opening his mouth now. And I've changed my mind. Chris Hipkins stopped talking, challenge 2025. I disagree with my former stance. I don't stand by all my statements and Prime Minister's questions. I think that he should shut the fuck up if he can't say anything good. Because imagine that. Like, imagine coming out just to swing at someone like Tamatha Paul, who is correct, to try to get votes that you're never going to get. And not talk about I won't say this is a distraction because I think it actually goes hand in hand with it in manufacturing the consent for it, for this new sentencing amendment bill, along with, and I want to point out that National recently actually just shoved through under urgency, meaning it was passed in one day, an amendment to the Bail Act for the sentencing bill and not discuss actually what it contains. Because the notion of restricting judicial discretion to cap it at an arbitrary number like 40% is a real concern, right? And there are a lot of reasons why, and we could go into all of the reasons why. But one thing that I will say about it is this is not a hypothetical scenario. The biggest discounts nearly always come from collaboration, i.e. flipping and snitching, right? Because you need some kind of protection, so you probably shouldn't be in the prison population. So in order to get somebody down to home detention range, oftentimes that's the only way that it can be done. If it is capped at 40%, you are actively stopping the police, if you're supposed to be like, a tough on crime person, from being able to dismantle these networks of organized crime. That's just one little thing. So ostensibly, if that's something that you cared about, fettering judicial discretion this way is going to do that.
But I mean, it comes down to the fact that, as we said right at the start of this part of the conversation, they just want more people in prison. It's why they're currently expanding Waikaria, right? Like, They want more people in prison. That is the purpose of it. And is it Mark Mitchell was just saying recently, like they expect the prison population to they're like planning for it to get to ridiculous numbers.
Yeah, well, Mitchell said he anticipated it could be 14,000, the prison population. That would bring New Zealand's per capita of prisoners per 100,000. At the moment, it is currently double Canada's, and it's above both England and Australia's per capita numbers. But that would bring it in line with about Iran, right?
Right.
Because yeah, I mean, they're looking at what the sort of Trump administration is getting away with, and they're calibrating. They're going, okay, well, we don't know if we can get away with that, but we can certainly push the boat out a little bit because this is what the US did, and nobody
Yeah.
said anything. So maybe we can try it. And it's very clear, like these enormous breaches in the United States of judicial process with their Gestapo literally like lifting citizens off the street for speech, literally just talking for the words that they've said, lifting them out, arresting them, detaining them, putting them in facilities that they are not reporting. So you can look up their like arrest record and it won't say what facility they're being kept in. So they're literally taking them to black sites.
And we're only seeing like one out of
whatever one makes it
hundreds.
high profile. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
There are
just
people being
whatever one
disappeared. Like
breaks above the surface, and they're being disappeared for political views. But I think that I probably like a couple of years ago, maybe one of my first ever episodes we talked about on this podcast, I was saying about how like every Western country is kind of looking to America to vanguard this kind of fascism.
Yeah.
They're going, we are heading into a period of extreme crisis, capitalist crisis, but also environmental crisis. We are seeing the sort of rise of class consciousness, of awareness of the negative elements of American empire and Western hegemony. And as that stuff grows, the response from governments has not been, well, how do we make concessions to the working class? How do we offer them some kind of nice way out? Which is what they did in the past. It's the FDR method. They're instead going, how do we crack down on this behavior? And one of them is expanding prison populations. It's increasing, bringing back 3 strikes. It's pushing out laws that will allow the government to crack down on people further.
the incoming protest law, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's part of why ACT in particular, as well as Outriders, I think some media organizations have been trying to push this abolish prisons wedge, right? Which is a purely like US attack on the left, and which no one had mentioned, right? Until ACT just started asking the question about it. But it was used very effectively during the Black Lives Matters protests to carve off a section of the US left within the Democratic Party, and blame radical leftists for all the failures of the Dems to take back seats from the Republicans because they weren't catering enough to the far right and to authoritarian carceral policy. So they're actively like just trying to fucking cookie cutter that over into New Zealand, and it's like they're doing with stuff like DEI, right, or woke. Like stuff DEI doesn't exist here. Like, we don't have something called that here, but they have no other way to conceptualize this stuff because they're fucking idiots. And they know that their really core supporter base, the people who are running around rabidly on behalf of the ACT Party, are just totally plugged into this fucking pipeline of American
That's the
far-right
thing,
slop.
yeah. Because they tried it on with the term co-governance. They tried to pejorativize it, but they kept finding resistance. Like fucking Leo Malloy being like, "Nah, co-governance is good. I like working with Māori groups." Like they just couldn't get any traction. So they're like, "Oh, fine, we'll just copy paste the American model. That kind of works because they're all watching Fox News every day anyway."
Yeah. But it just means like if the New Zealand media here like had any it's not even any point talking about them. They're all watching Fox News and MSNBC all the time as well. And so they're more than happy to use terms like DEI non-ironically, because they think everyone knows what it is because it's the only fucking like waveform they're getting. It's absurd.
There's that old pan of the fascist movement, which is that we didn't want to do the concentration camps. You forced our hand by being gay. Like that's always like that's the whole playbook is just we didn't want to be fascist, but you just did a thing that annoyed us a little bit, and we have to.
Yeah,
It's that pathetic sort of obligate, like, oh, we don't really believe in that stuff because they know it's reprehensible. They know that it makes the average person fucking sick. And so they have to be like, well, this is simply a response.
What's
Which
frustrating
reminds
is
me, it brings me back to that RNZ framing of Israel Gaza. Israel is not violently carrying out the most brutal genocide of the 21st century. Israel is not intentionally burning children to death in hospital beds. Israel is responding.
Yeah. And I've seen similar stuff being used to like give Hipkins an out for the way he responded to Tamatha Paul's comments, right? Where he said,
He called her an idiot.
yeah, like that's stupid. She should apologize to police, right? Like, what the fuck, bro? Like, oh, but she should have spoken better. She shouldn't have said something so stupid then. Like, what? Like, are you fucking kidding me? Oh, he has to respond that way because he has to be in the police's corner because that's what voters want. You know, like, get over it. Come on.
If that's the case, what you're supposed to do as the leader of Labour is give a neutral thing and say, "Oh, look, I understand both perspectives."
Or just like, well, like,
I mean, it's cowardly, but it's what you can do.
this is a really easy out. Well, that's a different political party, and I'm not going to speak about their views. What I think is we should support the police, right? Like, I mean, come the fuck on. Like, they're
Yeah,
really
you could
easy
be you could just be a different. You could still be a coward. You just be a different brand of coward
Yeah,
that's slightly more palatable.
Not looking forward to Christopher Hipkins continuing on this track and becoming increasingly more anti-woke. That's all I've got to say. I don't want to be saying in 3 to 4 months, you heard it here first. Look at Keir Starmer. Now look at Chris Hipkins. Same picture.
Yeah, soon Chris Hipkins is going to be banning ninja swords on the anniversary of the
Wow,
AG9
that just
declaration.
Makes sense. It's just good. That's just good policies. Banning ninja swords. We can't have ninja swords.
Which ninja sword?
Chris Hipkins dismantling the woke shogunate.
the wokenate.
The woke shogunate.
The
Jesus.
Shinobi Foot Clan, finally, those ninjas that have been running around will deal with them. Obviously, samurai protected. You can still have your katana, your adachi. Don't worry about that. But you cannot have ninjato because
we're getting rid of the
Tanto
woke
maybe,
shogunate.
wakizashi, but a side-eye, katana absolutely not.
We're getting rid of the woke shogunate.
Actually, I think a lot of
actually-
people are quite disrespectful to their daimyo, and they're coming around at the kotatsu and on the tatamis and having some sado, some tea ceremony, but they're not actually respecting the daimyo. They don't bow properly. They don't do it at the appropriate angle of 90 degrees. I think we need education in schools to help them to bow.
Horrible.
Very good Keir impression, though.
You're gonna have to start working on your Chris Hipkins impression. I'm sorry.
It doesn't sound like anything because he isn't anything.
Yes.
He isn't anything.
Isn't
He's just a
anything
loaf
is
of
a
bread.
brutal comeback to that. You're like, I can't make a good impression of him because he's just fucking nothing. He's
What
just-
impression does Chris Hipkins make in your mind? He slips off.
What are you saying is Chris Hipkins is the everyman. I get it.
He's
Yeah, old
Teflon.
Chippy in his hoodie. It's fucking nerdy student president who wanted to be prime minister from the day that he was born. Yeah, so he's so casual. I'd love to go to the dairy and get a pie with him.
Oh God, yeah, his whole it's time for me to develop a personality. I'm gonna just talk about sausage rolls. What a cunt.
And what a great place to end the episode. Thank you for joining me, everybody. Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Ginny. Thank you, Simone. We got through quite a bit there. Thank you to the audience for joining us. I'll put a couple of the articles we talked about into the podcast summary so you can read those and share those as well as sharing this podcast episode so that you can help people find out that there is media analysis happening. There is at least one group trying to unpick the information warfare being waged on us by far-right corporates and lobby groups. And get on board. Join us. Help us to fight back, I guess. Join an organization and start organizing because it's getting bad out there.
And if you're looking for organizations to join, Hamas is recruiting. Hezbollah is always looking for new numbers.
They're gonna claim that you're working for them anyway, so why not get in early?
Just an unpaid
Hezbollah has the coolest
influencer.
flag.
All right, catch you later, everybody.
If artificers are then I'm living a pointless life, but learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The road's upon now. It's paved with good intentions, and I'll admit that I'm at a lost what to say when they quote us as a cost we ought to stay. 'Cause I live amongst the people every day in this vindictive, forgetful fucking race.